Crew chief was providing aerial support on a night raid targeting Taliban drug operations in mid-2012. The Department of Defence says it can't comment while an inquiry into alleged war crimes is underway. Victoria's Premier has been directed to provide additional evidence to the hotel quarantine inquiry. It follows an extraordinary sitting yesterday at which the Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, was asked to explain emails that contradict his evidence. The state continues to record low daily coronavirus cases with 3 new infections. Queensland's LNP has announced it would empower police to detain children in Townsville and Cairns if it wins the upcoming state election. Deb Frecklington says her government would impose a curfew of 8 o'clock for unaccompanied children aged 14 and under, and 10 o'clock for those between 15 and 17. Amnesty International has questioned if the policy is legal. And the US government is suing Google, accusing the internet company of abusing its dominance in online search and advertising. It's the Justice Department's most significant attempt to protect competition since a landmark case against Microsoft more than 20 years ago. In a controversial first, British researchers are preparing to infect healthy young volunteers with the virus that causes COVID-19. The aim is to study the disease and potentially speed up development of a vaccine. Critics question the need to expose healthy people to the virus, but the team behind the study says the risk is warranted. Nick Dole reports from London.
Before the pandemic, Robert Hatfield was selling chocolate to the masses. Now he's volunteering to catch the virus for them too.
If you can do something and you can help, then that's something that I'm willing to do.
There are dozens of vaccines in the testing phase, but waiting for participants to be naturally exposed to COVID-19 takes time. So UK scientists plan to deliberately infect healthy volunteers between 18 and 30 years of age.
The probabilities of me dying or anything is very, very low. And so when I think about what society gains by getting a vaccine sooner, I'm not that worried about the risks.
It's at this hospital in London that scientists will determine how much virus it takes to infect someone with COVID-19. The volunteers will be given a dose as a nasal drop, then treated with the antiviral drug remdesivir as soon as they're infected. Once an appropriate dose is identified, scientists could run a series of trials testing several vaccines.
And that's really the end point of the study, is not them getting high fever or hypoxic or anything of that sort. We're hoping not to see that at all because we're starting with such small, cautious doses.
Volunteers can expect to stay in hospital for at least a fortnight and be paid about $8,000. There are ethical issues because the long-term effects of the virus remain unclear, but not acting has its own ethical implications.
Some people will give a kidney to a stranger. Some people will give their lives for their country. I think it's entirely reasonable to allow people to be altruistic, especially when their sacrifices could save hundreds of thousands of lives over the next months.
The study still needs regulatory approval. If it gets the go-ahead, scientists will start infecting volunteers in January, with results expected by May next year. Nick Dole, ABC News, London.
Any vaccine would be widely welcomed across Europe, with the continent again in the grip of a COVID-19 resurgence. For more, I'm joined by Peter Droback, who's a global health and infectious diseases physician at the University of Oxford. Peter Droback, thank you so much for your time. What's your view on the new trial in the UK that sees healthy young people infected with SARS-CoV-2?
I have to say I'm a bit concerned about it. Scientifically, I think it's very interesting, and these human challenge trials can be powerful and can get us critical information much more quickly than the large-scale clinical trials that are now underway. But normally we only do human challenge trials for diseases for which there's an effective treatment. We don't yet have an effective treatment for COVID-19. Remdesivir has said some activity, but we certainly don't have evidence to suggest that it's a so-called cure. So we are exposing these volunteers potentially to significant risk. And for young, healthy people, we have seen that there is a troubling incidence of so-called long COVID, these long-term effects in multiple different organ systems of the body that we don't yet well understand. So there's significant significant risk and I think ethical concerns here.
Yeah, so is that the big risk rather than the prospect that they will die? Because those chances are relatively slim, aren't they?
In young, healthy people, the risk of mortality is indeed very low, but we don't know what the risk is of other chronic effects. We've seen that anywhere from 10 to 15% in different series. It's not measured, very effectively, and so we're just guessing a little bit at the incidence. But we're talking about a range of symptoms from chronic fatigue and difficulty concentrating to inflammation of the heart and effect on many different organ systems. So, one of the things we get stuck with COVID is just thinking about, death being the only bad outcome, but in fact, there are other concerns as well.
So Europe is in the midst of its second wave with about 150,000 cases a day. Until Ireland today, no European nation had reimposed countrywide lockdowns. What's changed this time around?
We're seeing a very alarming, steep rise in the number of cases. It's difficult to compare case numbers now to case numbers in the spring because we're doing a lot more testing now. So we probably missed a lot of cases in the spring. What's troubling, though, is the rate at which the cases are increasing. For example, in the UK, we're seeing a doubling in the number of cases every 2 weeks. And that exponential growth, as we've all come to know, is how outbreaks get under control. What's different this time is that most governments seem very hesitant to take the more aggressive, quick action that we saw earlier on. Lockdowns, for example, there's a lot of pandemic fatigue. There's a lot of resistance to the idea of lockdowns. And of course, there's concern about further economic hit. But we're unfortunately stuck in this really bad middle place now, where a lot of governments are taking kind of half-wise measures, curfews, closing bars early, small measures to try to stem the rise in infections. And unfortunately, it just hasn't been enough. I suspect we'll see more countries going the direction of Ireland in announcing at least short-term lockdowns to try to get this under control.
Yeah, the WHO even has said that it doesn't advocate lockdowns as the primary means of control of coronavirus. So why should countries be looking at lockdowns?
Absolutely. Lockdowns are a last resort, and they're not a solution in and of themselves. They're only a way of buying time when you're at risk of the epidemic getting out of control. There's two ways that we can suppress the virus, in effect. One are individual things, physical distancing and masks and things like that to reduce the number of exposures that a population has. The other are public health infrastructure, widespread testing, contact tracing, and isolation to break chains of transmission. Always, when you can do more of the latter, you're better off. And some countries have been able to control this epidemic without having to resort to lockdowns. Unfortunately, when you get to a certain place, the number of infections can overwhelm any public health system. If you have 10, 20,000 new cases a day, there's no way that contact tracing can keep up. So that's when you have to impose or think about at least short-term measures. Maybe it's not a nationwide lockdown. It may be concentrated in localities, that are experiencing the highest burden of transmission, but you've got to do something to bring that baseline level of transmission down to a level where the public health system can help to manage it.
So what do you make of Sweden's approach, which never went into lockdown in the first place?
Sweden avoided lockdown, and though they claim otherwise, seem to have had a strategy of trying to allow controlled spread through the population, trying to shield the more vulnerable and see whether they could get to a level of herd immunity. And if that was the strategy, I think it was unsuccessful. Sweden's experienced one of the highest per capita mortality rates in the world. We saw 7% of Stockholm's nursing home population die from the virus in a 1-month period in the spring. And in fact, now we're also seeing the beginning of another wave of infections in Sweden, and they're beginning to impose social distancing and local lockdown type measures that are very similar to lots of other places. So they seem to have evolved their strategy and in fact come in line with lots of other countries.
So there are a lot of cases across Europe, but the death toll is not as high as it was in the first wave. In fact, it's nowhere near it. Is that because the treatment has come so far, or has the virus become less deadly?
There's no evidence or significant evidence that the virus has become less deadly. Certainly, we have made advances in our understanding of how to treat the disease. We have some effective treatments like dexamethasone that can reduce mortality, but also strategies for clinicians to manage patients on ventilators and things that help. However, we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. We're still in the early phases of this exponential rise, and hospitals are really starting to fill up. The real concern will be if we reach the point where hospital capacities are overwhelmed, that's when you could really start to see mortality rates rise. That's when you could see other aspects of medical services having to shut down, and you can then see mortality from other diseases as well. So if we don't stem the surge that we're experiencing right now, we absolutely can, unfortunately, expect to see a significant rise in the death toll.
Peter Droback, really good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Authorities in Vietnam and the Philippines are braced for another tropical storm that could cause heavy flooding and mudslides. The death toll in Vietnam from weeks of unrelenting rain has risen to more than 100, with dozens of people still missing. Floods have blocked roads and cut power, leaving people stranded without food or fresh water. Soldiers are evacuating people to higher ground. The Red Cross says it's the worst flooding in the region for years and will push millions of people towards the brink of poverty. The Hong Kong airline Cathay Pacific has announced it's cutting almost a quarter of its staff. 8,500 jobs will be axed, and its regional airline, Cathay Dragon, has been shut down. Airlines around the world have seen passenger numbers plummet because of the coronavirus. The International Air Transport Association estimates it will be at least 2024 before air traffic reaches pre-pandemic levels. One of New South Wales's biggest local governments is on the brink of collapse. The entire Central Coast Council is set to be suspended after it recently announced a budget black hole of almost $90 million. It doesn't even have enough cash to pay its staff this week, so the state government has agreed to cover wages.
Central Coast Council is crumbling under the weight of financial mismanagement and amalgamation. After announcing an $89 million debt earlier this month, today the Minister for Local Government made her intentions clear, and the elected council has 7 days to show why it shouldn't be sacked.
It's an appalling state of affairs that a council would get to this stage, that they can't find a resolution to their own financial problems.
For 3 consecutive days, the local council has held extraordinary meetings to try to come to terms with the financial catastrophe.
We've had a litany of issues that have been kept behind closed doors, that have not been made public. There's been no disclosure until suddenly it's all fallen apart. And that really rests on the Mayor and a block of councillors. After admitting there was not enough money to pay staff this week, the state government has agreed to advance council $6.2 million to cover payroll expenses for more than 2,000 workers. Former Wyong Mayor Bob Graham says there's only one option.
Go back to 2 councils and have a good close look at it, have a good close look at the way that it's going to be laid out.
The amalgamation between Gosford and Wyong was never unanimously supported in 2016, but is just one facet of the problem facing Central Coast Council. Flood, fire and COVID have all played their part, but until now no one realised just how dire the financial situation was.
Well, I was surprised at the extent. I mean, there's always going to be a few issues, but that was really bad.
The creation of the Super Council was expected to be a financial boon. Instead, it's now in financial doom. Emma Simkin, ABC News, Gosford.
Australia's peak disability service provider is urging young job seekers to consider a career in the disability support sector. Demand is expected to grow dramatically in coming years, and workers are already desperately needed in Tasmania's northwest.
Malachi Cloak de Paul was a security guard seeking more meaningful work when a friend suggested he switch to a career in disability support.
Absolutely love it. It was the best decision I think I've ever made.
He's now 6 years into the job, and much of that time has been with client Braden Glover.
We spend a lot of time out in our local community. We go to various different businesses and places and just have a great time.
National Disability Services is pushing for more young people to take up jobs as disability support workers, partly because young clients want young help. The introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme has created more demand for workers.
Nationally, it's estimated there'll be 90,000 jobs over the next 3 years in the disability sector, so there's definitely job availability.
There are more than 100 vacancies for disability support workers in Tasmania alone, with dozens in the northwest, a youth unemployment hotspot.
So have you already got that one? Yeah. Have you got the last one?
Employers try to match workers with clients who have similar interests.
They were trying to get to know who I was, my loves, my hobbies, what I found interesting, and then to use that to say, oh, we've got people with disability that also love those things.
They want to shake some of the stigmas.
People think that a lot of it is personal care, whereas that is a bit of an aspect, but you're also helping people participate in the community, you're helping them achieve their goals.
Workers don't always need qualifications to get a start in the industry. Malakai's employers have put him through a Certificate 4 in disability and a diploma in leadership and management.
For me, it's amazing because I didn't have the money to necessarily go to school, but having that opportunity within the organisations that I work that help me and facilitate that progression has been really rewarding for me in being able to take my career to different levels. Yeah, nice.
So what does it take to be a disability support worker? The NDS says you need to be a people person, physically able, be patient and empathetic, and enjoy solving problems.
Someone who can be flexible and adapt to the needs of their clients.
A new career opportunity when jobs are hard to come by. Selena Ross, ABC News.
New sections of a New South Wales forest in the Shoalhaven have been earmarked for logging despite the area being ravaged by bushfire last season. The Environment Protection Authority has raised concerns about the plans at the South Bruman State Forest. Critics in the local community say it poses an unacceptable risk to the environment.
The signs of logging in this burnt native forest aren't hard to find, but it's the prospect of expanded logging here that has many local residents worried.
The forest needs time to recover before they can be back, and it's not being done sustainably. They're taking habitat for the wildlife.
Forestry Corporation has previously been ordered to stop work at the South Bruman State Forest for 40 days after breaching rules set by the Environment Protection Authority earlier this year. It now wants to log other parts of the forest without specific conditions, something the EPA says would pose a major environmental risk.
If it's allowed to happen here, they'll try and do it all over the state, and that's why this campaign's so important.
Forestry Corporation has defended its environmental record, saying timber harvesting takes place in 0.1% of state forest each year, and there are strict rules to protect wildlife habitat.
The EPA says it will work with forestry to implement a long-term approach to post-bushfire logging. It says it will monitor all stages of the logging and won't hesitate to take strong action if any conditions are breached.
And residents say they'll be doing what they can to protect the forest. Jessica Clifford, ABC News, Bruman.
It's been 50 years since an old Canberra dairy farm was converted into the National Botanic Gardens. It's now a flourishing expanse of diverse ecosystems. And to celebrate half a century, the gardens have unveiled a new display celebrating one of Australia's most loved native plants.
From the red centre to the tropical north, a visit to the National Botanic Gardens is like taking a road trip across Australia.
We've got flora from right across the country. The Banksia Garden is no different.
The Banksia Gardens are now officially open.
The 50th anniversary display pays homage to one of Australia's most recognisable natives.
They provide wonderful habitat for a whole lot of nectar-feeding birds, mammals and so on. And they're just visually so interesting and engaging. There are ones that have round flowers that look like tennis balls, others that have big tall spikes.
70 species, representing every state and territory, are starting a new life in the bush capital. Staff have worked hard to create the right growing environment for each plant. Banksias from Kakadu and Western Australia posed a particular challenge.
We've had specialists from over in WA giving us their expertise. We've had growers down the south coast in New South Wales doing specialist grafting and working in with us so that we can unlock some of those secrets.
They are so healthy and happy living here. It's just magic, absolutely magic.
But not all the Banksias on display are thriving.
This is really about the story of how Banksias are impacted by fire.
The relationship between bushfire and Banksia is one of the more unusual themes in this display.
And then there's regeneration from seedlings post-fire, which is what happens in the natural landscape.
Recreating the wild in Canberra's backyard. Peter Doherty, ABC News, Canberra.
Exploring Australia's history has just become easier for school students thanks to the National Museum of Australia. The Defining Moments digital classroom is bringing the museum straight into schools across the country.
After a tough year in the classroom, this teacher is grateful to reignite a passion for learning in his students.
Cool, go for it. Have explored.
That freedom to give them exploration everywhere is fantastic. They're discovering things on their own and getting that aha moment that you wouldn't get if you forced them to look at one particular thing.
The pandemic has prevented the traditional school trips and excursions this year, but now exploring the moments that defined Australian history through a computer screen is not all too different from walking the halls of the National Museum itself.
It's got 3D images, which I find really cool. Also, there's a bunch of games that some of my classmates and me enjoy playing, and they're playing them together, which is also cool.
This digital classroom is taking them on a journey through time and space. With virtual tours, games and an array of video dug up from the archives, there's not a history book in sight.
It lets you understand it a bit better so that you can actually find it interesting.
In 1923, work began on the bridge.
From the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge
Shrapnel, rifle fire,
to the landing at Gallipoli, these students are gaining insight for the future by looking to the past.
All too frequently we play down our past, but our story with its challenges, with its difficult moments, but also with its great successes, is our history. It's unique. It's a story of this continent.
Teachers and students can explore Australia's history from their desks anytime and anywhere. And although the pandemic may pass and school excursions will once again be possible, there's hope this virtual lesson will stick around.
We're in Canberra, we're very lucky with all the institutions that we have here, but for more remote communities, having access to something like this means all the kids can experience going to the National Museum.
A national institution at every student's fingertips. Madeline Austin, ABC News, Canberra.